Okay, well this is part 2 of Unit 1 notes, and you see this on the board. I don't want you to panic about this. I'm going to give you a copy of this for your own notebook in class. But what this is a kind of a chart that talks about the colonies or settlements of the 3 main countries that colonized North America, being Spain, France, and England, and some of the differences between them. And again, that's one of the things we're going to want you to know is how is a Spanish colony different than a French or English, and so forth. And so it just kind of takes you through, you know, first of all, they're going to settle in different places. The Spanish ones are in the south, southwest. The French ones are in the north and more in the interior of North America along rivers like the Mississippi. And then the English ones are going to be along the coast, the first permanent English one being Jamestown. Then it talks about their relationship with the Indians, how France treated the Indians the best. We're very kind of inclusive. You can see that because there was a lot of intermarriage or mingling between the 2 groups. England treating them the worst, often abusive and very hostile to the Indians. And then the Spanish being in the middle, where they're kind of inclusive but not as much as the French. And you'll see some marriages there. The purposes are also different. Spain is coming primarily for gold and silver and natural resources, but primarily gold and silver. The French are coming for the fur trade. That's very lucrative, or big bucks in Europe at the time, making lots of stuff out of fur. So that's why they're here. England is coming for permanent agricultural societies. They want to start new, small agricultural settlements here. The type, the Spanish ones are going to have relatively larger towns because they're going to rely a lot on trade with these natural resources, and so they're going to develop ports and towns. So their settlements tend to be larger in terms of number of people. The French, on the other hand, are going to have just trading outposts out in the middle of hostile territory, out of the middle of North America, just to gather the furs and then ship them downstream to the ships that send them, you know, take them over to Europe. And the English are going to be in the middle in this one. They're going to have small, not as small as the French outposts, but small little settlements that are going to be filled with the same types of people with all the same kind of beliefs and purposes, like the Puritans, for example, in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And how are these colonies going to be run? Well, the Spanish colonies are going to be run very tightly. They're going to have lots of rules and regulations. They're going to be run by a governor appointed by the king, who's very loyal to the king. Naturally, if you're going to have people in charge of gold and silver, the king's going to want to make sure he sees that and doesn't have to worry about as many people kind of lining their own pockets. He's going to pick someone very loyal, someone dedicated. The French really not going to have much government at all, really. They're really going to follow a lot of the local Indian customs and rules and regulations, primarily because they have to deal with the Indians. And so they're going to follow how they do things more than set down their own guidelines. And the English are going to be mostly governing themselves because they're not, you know, having a lot of contact with people back in Europe. They're not necessarily, excuse me, beholden to a governor. Now that'll change over time. In some of the colonies, it'll be different. You'll have more governor that are loyal to the king, but that'll come more later. Early on, it's mostly these self-government people where settlements where they have to make their own rules and regulations and figure out their own punishment. So again, I'll give you a copy of this in class. That's just a quick rundown, but you will have to know what's different about the 3 types of colonies. And again, there's more countries that colonize than these 3, but these are the 3 that have the most settlement. So we'll move on then, and we'll talk about the worlds colliding, and then how did this change? How did this impact change North America, particularly for the Native Americans? So if you're a Native American, it's not a good time for you. It's really disastrous. And the question here is on the board as to why. What would be so bad about this? And I think if you think about this and you go back to, again, your other history classes you've taken, you know the answer to this. Certainly, a lot of it's going to be due to diseases like smallpox that the Europeans are going to bring over with them, and you're going to suffer a lot because of that. Your population is going to be devastated. When Columbus comes, there's tens of millions of Native Americans running around in different parts of North America, and they're very devastated by these diseases. You know, depending on who you believe, a third to a half of these populations are going to be wiped out by these diseases. There's also going to be tons of conflict between the whites and the Native Americans, conflict between the whites and their government, contact between the Indians and the Indians. There's just going to be a lot more turmoil. It's going to be a chaotic life. Again, that's kind of why the word collide really fits here. There's going to be tons of conflict by all different types of group here. Some of the most famous ones are Bacon's Rebellion and the Pueblo Revolt. The Pueblo Revolt takes place in Southwest, where they revolt against the Spanish monarchy, or the Spanish governor, I guess is probably a better way to say that. And Bacon's Rebellion is in the Middle Colonies, and that started because a lot of the settlers were moving further and further west and infringing on Native American land, and the Indians didn't like that. And so they fought back and they resisted, and when the governor didn't help the whites against the Indians as much as they would like, they kind of got a little angry and resented that, because they thought, oh, you know, we're just kind of poor folk. If we were richer people, you'd get your butt out here and help us. And so they kind of rebelled against the government in that case. And those are some of the first examples of people in North America revolting against authority. And that's kind of what makes them important to remember, is these are kind of the people that laid the groundwork. That's going to be a theme in our nation's history, of people revolting against authority or challenging authority. And that was unusual, because if you were from old Europe, you didn't challenge authority very often. If you did, you often paid the ultimate price. But here in America, it's a little different. We're laying the groundwork for that. And these are two really good examples, some of the first examples of people doing that. Certainly one of the big impacts is also going to be, we're going to have a culture exchange. We're going to have an exchange of ideas and products and these kind of things. And you may remember this from junior high days too. This is called the Columbian Exchange, because of Columbus, obviously. When Columbus started to bring new products and animals and plants and ideas back to England, and then he also brought new things over here as well as the other colonists did. New products like tobacco, animals like horses, ideas like Christianity. So these two worlds collided, and when they did, ideas and ways of life and beliefs were also exchanged, which had a tremendous impact. They changed how people lived in Europe, and they certainly changed how people lived in America, whether that be your diet or your belief system or your traditions or your dress or whatever it might be. That's the Columbian Exchange. That's a pretty important event to remember. Okay? Another thing that's going to happen, another big impact, is that Europe is going to get a permanent foothold in America. They're going to get their foot in the door, and they're not going to leave. When England gets here and establishes colonies that can survive on their own and exist over time, that basically is kind of the turning point for Native Americans, because if they could have thrown them out right away, maybe they could have resisted white settlement and things would have been quite different. But when these first colonies, for the most part, succeed and flourish, that just leads to more and more whites, and that gradually leads then to Indians being pushed more and more further west and losing their way of life, so to speak. So that's an impact. And then finally, we have the roots of self-government. Because in North America we're so separated from Europe and the powers over there, it takes months for letters to exchange and things like that. The people living here had to govern themselves for the most part, because they had no one else to do it. There are exceptions to that, but the point here being, the idea that of Americans running their own lives, setting their own rules, electing their own leaders and doing things their own way, were first established here really early on, and people got accustomed to that, got used to doing things that way. And that's one of the reasons they put up so much fuss and eventually revolted against England, is when that kind of tradition was trying to be taken away from them, when England tried to say, no, we're going to do it our way now, you can't do it that way, even though you've done it that way since the beginning. No more. And so that's important as well, because people governing themselves becomes a tradition in America, that they are not very willing to give up. So this is part 2, just talking a little bit about, continuing our talk, I guess, rather, about these two worlds colliding.